The chandeliers above the ballroom burned like constellations, a sky made of glass and gold. Laughter floated between the tables, silverware clinking like punctuation to rehearsed smiles. The Byrne Foundation's annual charity gala had always been an evening of power disguised as generosity, where billionaires pretended empathy in exchange for better press. And tonight, at the center of it all, stood my ex-husband. Ethan Avery tailored navy tuxedo, smile rehearsed to perfection, lifting a champagne flute beside his new wife. Carly Bennett, my best friend. The woman who used to cry in my kitchen about rent, who'd once promised to be my maid of honor no matter what. Now she stood under the spotlight in silk the color of borrowed innocence, the name Avery glittering on the event's donor wall behind her. They looked perfect. But perfection is just lighting. It hides the rot underneath. I waited until the applause softened. The stage lights dimmed to a warm gold, a cue for the next speech. Then I moved, heels on marble, click, 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 cutting through the murmur like a metronome of tension. Heads turned. A few cameras followed out of curiosity before realizing I wasn't on the guest list. The maitre d' tried to intercept me, his smile faltering. I didn't slow down. My black dress caught the reflection of every chandelier I passed, sharp and liquid, like armor made of ink. By the time I reached the center aisle, Ethan's expression had cracked. He knew the sound of my steps long before he saw my face. Lauren Carley's voice trembled, half whisper, half warning. I stopped in front of their table. The air smelled of roses and fear from my clutch. I drew a thick, cream-colored envelope sealed with a gold notary band. The embossed words shimmered under the light trust deed. You said I'd never rise again. Ethan. My voice didn't carry anger, only precision. Yet here I am with the clause your attorney forgot to read. A gasp cut through the room. Every phone lifted at once, little glass witnesses eager for blood. Ethan rose from his chair, face tightening into the same polite charm he used to mask lies. Lauren, this isn't the place. Oh, I think it is, I said, sliding the envelope across the linen tablecloth until it stopped against his untouched wine glass. The seal faced him like a verdict. This, I added, is the part where you remember my mother taught me to read every line before I sign. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy, electric, the kind that hums right before a storm hits. Even the orchestra in the corner faltered, one violin string squealing off note before fading completely. A photographer's flash went off white lightning across marble. Someone whispered, "Is that the Lauren Avery?" Another voice. Low and odd, I thought she disappeared after the divorce. Carly's hand found Ethan's sleeve, her diamond flashing like an SOS. "Please," she murmured, "let's go somewhere private." But there's no privacy when the truth finally stands up. I took one step closer. Enough for my perfume cheap. Motel lavender to invade their designer air. I wanted them to breathe the fall they'd designed for me. You built your fortune on signatures that weren't yours, I said quietly. Tonight, we correct that. Ethan's jaw locked. Carly's smile cracked into something brittle. Behind them, the foundation's LED screen looped a slideshow of donors: Avery Holdings, Bennett Interiors, Byrne Trust. Each name glowed for 3 seconds before dissolving into another. The irony was immaculate, for a heartbeat. No one moved. Then, as if commanded by instinct, the entire ballroom froze forks midair, conversation severed. The kind of stillness you only get when money senses danger. The room went silent. I let it breathe that way. Let them all look. Let Ethan drown in the echo of his own disbelief. Enjoy the rest of your evening, I said finally, turning toward the exit. The rest is for the lawyers, as I walked away. Whispers chased me, fragments of disbelief. Envy, curiosity, the kind of noise that feeds headlines by morning, but all I heard was the rhythm of my own pulse, calm and deliberate, at the door. I paused. The reflection in the glass showed a woman no one recognized, not the wife they discarded, not the accountant they destroyed, someone reconstructed out of ashen proof, I whispered, to no one in particular. They said I'd never rise again. Funny thing about ashes, they hide embers. Outside, Manhattan rain slicked the pavement into silver. My Uber idled at the curb, a ghost light waiting. As I stepped inside, I unclenched my fist. The imprint of the notary seal had pressed into my palm, circular and deep, like a promise branded under skin. The driver glanced at me through the mirror. "You good?" "Ma'am," I smiled. "Getting there." As the city blurred past, I pulled out the second envelope smaller, worn, edges frayed. The paper that had started everything, the one that still smelled faintly of mildew and motel smoke, 6 months ago. I'd been eating canned soup in a room crawling with roaches, staring at this same envelope, not yet knowing it contained $70,000, a flight ticket, and a note that would change the trajectory of every person in that ballroom. The night I found it. The wind had rattled the motel window like it wanted in. The air smelled of disinfectant and hopelessness. That suitcase had been sealed shut. My name carved on its tag in my mother's handwriting, the same hand that had signed the clause Ethan forgot existed. Back then. I didn't know why someone would leave me money wrapped in silence, or why the note inside said, "This is just travel money. The real fortune is waiting at this address." But now I do. Because that night was the beginning of the excavation, not of wealth, but of truth. And if you've ever lost everything, your job, your home, even your sense of worth, you'll understand why I opened it. Would you have opened that suitcase? Tell me in the comments. Morning light in Connecticut has a different texture. It doesn't burst through the windows, it seeps in politely, filtered through white curtains and a sense of quiet wealth. Our townhouse on Elmridge Lane was designed for symmetry marble foyer, staircase like a question mark. Every flower in the front yard trimmed into submission. I used to think order meant safety. For 7 years. My life looked like a magazine spread for successfully settled. I was Lauren Avery, CPA, senior financial analyst at Avery and Byrne Holdings, the kind of woman who color-coded her expense reports and ironed pillowcases on weekends. I had my husband, Ethan, the charismatic face of every deal room photo, and a best friend, Carly Bennett, who could make a thrifted dress look like Dior. We were a curated trio, polished, photogenic, and perfectly harmless. At least that's what it looked like from the outside. Every weekday began the same, a short commute from Westport to the firm's glass tower in Midtown Manhattan. I'd arrive early, coffee in hand, a quiet observer in a world that rewarded loudness. The reception smelled of bergamot and ambition. Ethan worked a few floors above, technically in a different department, though somehow our work kept intersecting. The firm's CEO, Martin Byrne, had once been Ethan's mentor, an elegant man with the charm of old money and the hunger of new. He liked to call us the golden couple. We smiled at that, though I often wondered what kind of gold he meant, the metal that shines, or the kind that cages. At work. My desk overlooked the Hudson, all blue in distance. I specialized in financial compliance, the invisible scaffolding holding up other people's risks. I was good at it, meticulous, invisible, indispensable, in finance. Those 3 words often mean replaceable. Evenings belong to social rituals, benefit dinners, rooftop cocktails, art auctions that smelled like tax deductions. Carly floated effortlessly among them, champagne in one hand, compliment in the other. She was always near Ethan, styling him for events, adjusting his cufflinks, laughing at jokes I'd already heard. I told myself it was friendship, or professionalism, or both, because in our world, boundaries blur under dim lighting and $200 bottles of Pinot Noir. Weekends were quieter. The townhouse was full of the sounds of maintenance dishwashers humming, sprinklers ticking, Ethan typing in the study. We hosted dinners where everything was effortlessly perfect: roast lamb, gold flatware, a playlist curated to sound spontaneous. I became fluent in polite smiles and subtle comparisons. Every guest had a title. Conversations revolved around equity and perfection. Carly always arrived late, wearing something that made the room pause. She'd kiss my cheek and say, "You make stability look chic." I never knew if it was a compliment or a eulogy. My mother, Margaret Reeves, would have seen through it all. She'd been a law professor at Columbia Sharp, deliberate, allergic to illusions, the kind of woman who could dismantle a lie with one raised eyebrow before she died. She told me once, "If you sign without reading, you're not being loyal, you're being blind." At the time, I thought she meant legal contracts. I didn't realize she was warning me about people. After her funeral, I found her favorite fountain pen tucked into an old case, Engraved along its silver body, "Truth is in the margins." I kept it on my desk at work, a silent reminder that precision could be armor. Ethan used to tease me for it. "You and your pens." He'd laugh. "You should learn to trust people, not paperwork." Funny how the two are always connected. There was a comfort to routine, the illusion of permanence. On Sunday mornings, I'd wake before Ethan, pour coffee into a white mug labeled hers, and sit on the balcony watching the neighborhood wake up joggers, gardeners, golden retrievers chasing predictability. We seemed happy. We looked happy. We performed happy. But sometimes. When Ethan's phone buzzed at 2 a.m. and he stepped out of bed whispering, "Just a client," I'd feel that thin crack in the mirror of our life, a hairline fracture you can't unsee once the light hits it. Carly's texts grew shorter. Her laughter with Ethan, longer and still. I told myself stories. "They're close because we're all friends. It's just work. You're overthinking again. Lauren." Denial is an elegant anesthetic. One Thursday evening. I stayed late at the office finishing quarterly reports. The city was rain-soaked, red taillights sliding down the glass towers. I glanced at my reflection in the monitor, a woman in a cream blouse, gold chain, tired eyes. A woman doing everything right and still not being seen. I opened the firm's internal dashboard, my digital comfort zone, rows of numbers, columns of logic, everything neat. Then I saw something odd, a new file under Burn Heritage Accounts. The name struck me. Heritage. My mother used to mention a scholarship fund she'd advised under that name years ago. Curiosity nudged me to click. The access was restricted. Authorized users only? Strange. I was the senior accountant overseeing compliance for that department. There shouldn't have been anything I couldn't see. I sent a routine access request, nothing serious, just standard protocol. Then I shut down my computer, convinced it was a glitch. Outside. The rain had turned the pavement into mirrors. He was on the phone, laughing. When he noticed me, he slipped it into his pocket. "Long day," he asked. "Routine," I replied. He smiled, leaning in to kiss my forehead. "That's my girl, the one who keeps everything balanced." I didn't know it then, but balance was already tipping, that night, as I drifted into sleep beside him. A thought flickered, quiet but persistent. What if order wasn't safety? What if it was camouflage by morning? My access request would be denied by week's end. The first receipt gone. And by the time I realized how deep the deception ran, my perfectly curated life would collapse faster than the markets I used to audit. It started small, the way most fractures do. Ethan began traveling more, calling them fundraising trips. At first, I believed him. The firm had recently expanded into philanthropic investments, and Martin Byrne liked to present every deal as doing good while doing well. Ethan was his golden mouthpiece, charming, photogenic, fluent in persuasion. But the destinations? They always caught my eye. San Diego, Aspen, Montreal, and then, in one of Carly's Instagram stories, 15 seconds of champagne bubbles and city lights, I caught the reflection of a hotel logo in the glass. The same one Ethan had mentioned the night before. When I asked about it, Carly laughed through the phone. "Oh my God. Small world, I'm styling a client for the same gala Ethan's attending." Total coincidence. Coincidences have expiration dates. At home, I tried to silence my unease with routine. Coffee at 6, train at 7, Excel sheets, compliance meetings, quarterly projections. Numbers were predictable, people weren't. One afternoon, while updating Ethan's tax prep, a habit I'd kept since our first year of marriage, I noticed an entry that didn't belong: a $42,000 consulting payment from Byrne & Associates Philanthropic Fund. My stomach tightened. That fund was part of the same entity I managed at work, the one under review for audit. I rechecked the line item. Scrolling down to the digital signature, Ethan's, clear. Confident strokes, I whispered to myself. Why would the firm pay him directly? I printed the page. Just to feel the paper, my mother used to say. If it's not on paper, it doesn't exist. That night, I brought it up over dinner. "Did you do some consulting for the Byrne Fund?" I asked casually, slicing roasted chicken. Ethan didn't look up from his phone. Briefly, just helped them with strategy for an outreach event. Martin wanted my input. For $42,000, He paused, smiled like a politician. You've seen what they pay consultants. Babe, it's all above board. The way he said babe made me feel small, like a child asking about grown-up things. I let it go. But something lodged beneath my ribs and stayed there 2 weeks later. I was alone in the office finishing an audit report long after everyone else had gone home. The floor was silent, city lights winking through the glass like Morse code. I pulled up the internal records for the firm's charitable trusts, a maze of sub-accounts labeled with bland names: Education Support Initiative, Community Empowerment, Heritage Programs. And then, there it was, Byrne Heritage Trust. The name hit me like cold air. My mother's scholarship fund had carried the same name when she was alive, a project she'd helped structure for underprivileged law students, after her death. It had quietly dissolved, or so I thought. But this account wasn't for scholarships. It was moving 6 figures a month through consulting retainers and charitable allocations. Recipients included shell entities with no addresses, no public filings, no audits. One transaction, labeled Partnership Discretionary Transfer, matched the date of Ethan's payment. I felt my pulse spike, that accountant's instinct screaming in the back of my mind, numbers that don't balance always mean someone's lying. I clicked deeper into the metadata. Tracing the authorization trail. Someone had approved the transaction using my employee credentials, except I hadn't. The timestamp placed the approval at 11:47 p.m., 2 months earlier, a night I'd been home, asleep beside Ethan. When I confronted him the next morning, he didn't even look surprised. Lauren, seriously? He said, half laughing, stirring sugar into his coffee. It's just a naming coincidence. Byrne uses that trust label for multiple projects. Don't get paranoid. He handed me my travel mug, kissed my cheek like nothing had happened. The gesture felt rehearsed, precise, habitual, empty. But paranoia wasn't what I felt. It was familiarity. The same quiet alert my mother used to have before dismantling a bad argument in her classroom. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling fan, hearing her voice in my memory. You don't lose your sight all at once. First, the light dims, then you stop noticing the dark. I'd built my life around the belief that honesty could be measured in spreadsheets. Now I wasn't sure if I'd been keeping the books or helping someone cook them. The next day at the office, Martin Byrne called a staff meeting about new philanthropic partnerships. Carly was there, sitting too close to Ethan, typing notes that didn't require typing. Martin smiled as he spoke about transparency and legacy behind him. The projector displayed the same name again, Byrne Heritage Trust, in gold serif letters. When the meeting ended, Martin clasped my shoulder warmly. Lauren, your attention to detail is why we trust you with our most sensitive accounts. I smiled back, polite as marble, but I noticed his cufflinks engraved with the same insignia printed on the internal documents I'd reviewed. Trust wasn't an abstract value here. It was a brand. That evening, I found a missing receipt in Ethan's expense folder, a hotel charge from Montreal, billed to Avery Holdings, but categorized as client entertainment. No names, no notes. Just a date that matched Carly's Instagram story. The line item was small, $987, but it was proof. Proof that their business trips weren't entirely about business. Proof that coincidences were just lies with better lighting. I printed the receipt, folded it neatly, and slid it into the same folder as the consulting payment. Evidence. Not yet confrontation, just paper. The only witness that never forgets. At brunch that weekend, Carly gushed about her new client connections, all while wearing a gold bracelet I'd seen Ethan give her once as a birthday gift for helping him plan a surprise for me. She laughed, radiant, leaning into Ethan's shoulder while telling a story about jet lag and hotel mix-ups. Everyone at the table smiled. Everyone except me. I stirred my mimosa, watching bubbles rise and vanish. Maybe that's what my life had become, a glass of disappearing moments. Sweet on the surface, hollow underneath, that night, while folding laundry. I found one of Ethan's shirts monogrammed, crisp, and smelling faintly of a cologne I didn't recognize. Inside the pocket was a folded business card, Byrne Heritage Consulting Group Private Division. No phone number, no address, just the logo. I placed it on the dresser beside my mother's old fountain pen. The two objects couldn't have been more different. One symbolized deception, the other truth. And somewhere between them stood me the woman too afraid to look too closely at the life she'd signed for without reading. It was one of those nights when sleep refuses to arrive, when the house feels too quiet, too staged. Ethan was in Boston for meetings, and I sat in bed with my iPad, trying to lose myself in spreadsheets. I must have fallen asleep scrolling, because when I woke, the screen had dimmed to a soft glow beside me. A new notification blinked across it. Subject board signed. She'll never notice until the escrow clears. Sender Carly Bennett. The preview line below was worse. Tell Martin we'll finalize once her credentials are revoked. My pulse stuttered. I unlocked the iPad. The message was part of a chain Ethan's account, linked to our shared cloud. Carly's tone was casual, flippant, as if betrayal had become just another project update. Carly board signed. She'll never notice until the escrow clears. Ethan. You're sure her access is cut? Carly Martin's handling it. She still thinks it's a scholarship fund? My throat went dry. Scholarship fund? Byrne Heritage Trust? They weren't just using the name. They were using my mother's foundation as cover. I sat there in the dark, staring at the messages as the seconds stretched thin. It wasn't just infidelity anymore, it was coordination. Paper trails. Signatures. Intent. I opened my laptop, heart hammering, and logged into the firm's secure portal. My access was still active then. I typed escrow into the search bar. A contract appeared, Byrne Heritage Land Acquisition, Phase 3. The signatories Ethan Avery and Carly Bennett. The escrow amount $2.3 million. The funding source Byrne Heritage Trust. It wasn't a scholarship fund at all. It was a real estate shell laundering money through fake grants and development donations. Every transaction bore my digital approval signature, copied from prior audits I'd filed. They had forged my authorization to mask the flow of funds. Every number, every line item was a brick in a wall they'd built around me. By the time I heard the key in the front door, I'd printed the contract in the email chain. Ethan walked in, suit jacket slung over his shoulder, expression casual, that effortless charm that had once meant safety. You're home early, I said quietly. He smiled. Flight got canceled. Why are you up? I handed him the papers. Maybe you can tell me. His gaze flicked over the documents, then back to me, unreadable. You shouldn't go through my emails. Lauren. Then stop having my life in them. He set the pages down on the counter, as if they were harmless receipts. You're exhausted. You're reading numbers, not people. I laughed, once the kind that sounds like breaking glass. Numbers don't lie. He stepped closer, voice soft but cold. You really think Martin Byrne would risk everything to cheat you out of something? Come on. You've been under a lot of stress. Maybe take a few days off. The gaslight was almost elegant. Was Carly's message stress? 2, I asked. She'll never notice until the escrow clears. What did she mean? Ethan's eyes didn't flicker, but his jaw did. You're spiraling. I'm not doing this right now. He turned, went upstairs, leaving the silence behind like a slammed door. I sat there for hours, the house ticking around me. By morning, the air felt heavier, as if the storm had moved inside me instead. My debit card declined at the cafe near the station. I tried again. Same message, transaction declined, account frozen. I called the bank, my voice steady only because the panic hadn't fully landed. The representative sounded polite. Rehearsed. Your accounts are under temporary review due to a flagged transaction. It's a routine security measure. Routine. The same word Ethan always used before delivering bad news. I opened my work email on my phone, dozens of unread messages, most of them system alerts. The last one. From HR subject notice of administrative leave, pending review, effective immediately. Access suspended. I stared at it until the letters blurred. The email explained nothing except that the firm was conducting an internal compliance investigation and would appreciate my cooperation. I wasn't being consulted. I was being erased. I called Ethan, no answer. I texted Carly, the message failed to deliver. I opened Instagram and saw the worst confirmation of all. Carly Bennett has blocked you. Every photo we'd taken together vanished as if friendship were a file she'd deleted for storage space. By noon, I drove back to the townhouse. The driveway was empty. Inside, His office was immaculate, no laptop, no papers, nothing but the faint smell of his cologne. The framed photo of us from our anniversary was gone. So was the jewelry box I kept on my dresser. He hadn't left me. He'd pre-deleted me. A single envelope sat on the kitchen counter, written in Ethan's neat, accountant handwriting. Take care of yourself. You're not built for this world. There was no signature. No apology. Just that one line, half condescending, half prophetic. I tore it in half. But even that didn't make it disappear. That evening, I sat in the living room surrounded by the remnants of my own normalcy. The light outside faded to the color of older seats. The silence had weight. I kept replaying Carly's message in my mind. She'll never notice until the escrow clears. They'd built their entire plan on one assumption that I was too trusting, too careful, too afraid of conflict to ever question them. They were almost right. When I tried to log into my firm account again, the credentials were invalid. My name, the one I'd signed 100 times across compliance reports, had been scrubbed from the directory. That's when I realized this wasn't just personal betrayal. It was professional annihilation. Martin Byrne had quietly coordinated the perfect erasure-forged authorizations under my login, froze my accounts under the pretext of security, and cut off every channel of communication that might help me prove otherwise. My husband and my best friend weren't just cheating. They were collaborating, and they'd used the one thing I'd built my entire career on, trust, as their weapon. At midnight, I packed a bag, not out of clarity, but survival instinct, a few clothes, my mother's pen, the printed contracts, nothing else. I didn't have a destination, just the certainty that I couldn't stay in a house that had become a crime scene. As I closed the door behind me, I whispered to the darkness, "You're right, Ethan. I'm not built for your world." Then softer, "I'm built to expose it." The court hearing lasted 17 minutes, barely long enough for my heartbeat to slow between breaths. Ethan sat 2 chairs away, immaculate in a tailored gray suit, wedding band gone, expression measured to the decimal. His attorney, Gregory Vale, introduced himself as counsel and personal advisor to Mr. Bargy. Avery. I recognized him immediately, Martin Byrne's longtime legal partner, the same man who toasted with us at our wedding rehearsal dinner and told me I'd married into a dynasty. Now, he was dismantling my life line by line. The petitioner, Mr. Avery, seeks dissolution on grounds of emotional instability, professional misconduct, and breach of fiduciary responsibility. The words echoed like gunfire in a marble chamber. My attorney, a public defender, assigned last minute after the firm suspended my credentials, shuffled papers he hadn't had time to read. "Your Honor," he said, voice uncertain. "We'd like to request denied." The judge interrupted, tone clipped. "Proceed." And just like that, my marriage was reduced to bullet points. Gregory outlined episodes of paranoia, accusations without evidence, and potential ethical violations under internal audit review. He even submitted an HR report, one I'd never seen, claiming I'd accessed confidential data without authorization. The report was dated the same night I'd confronted Ethan about the escrow contract, when the judge asked if I had anything to say. I opened my mouth, but no sound came. My attorney placed a hand on my arm, a silent warning. The gavel struck once. The decision was final. I lost the house in Westport, the joint accounts, the car, the firm benefits, everything. What Ethan didn't take through legal strategy, Byrne's network finished off through rumor. She had a breakdown. Someone whispered in the office. She falsified reports. Another added, by the end of the week. My professional reputation, the one thing I'd built without help, was gone. And in a world like ours, reputation is currency. I was bankrupt in every sense of the word. 2 weeks later, I moved into a motel off Queens Boulevard, the kind of place you paid weekly, in cash, and where the front desk clerk didn't ask questions. Room 16 smelled of mold and disinfectant. A single flickering bulb hummed above the bed, its light the color of weak tea. I sat on the thin mattress that first night, holding my mother's fountain pen, the last thing that still felt real. Outside, someone was yelling. Inside, a roach crawled out from the radiator. The morning I finally did it, the sky over Queens was a dull, watchful gray for days. I barely moved, I lived on canned soup and instant coffee, scrolling job listings I was now underqualified for. As if a resume could unwrite public humiliation, the city outside kept moving taxis, sirens, lives that weren't mine. One evening, rain leaked through the window frame, forming a shallow puddle near the dresser. I crouched to shove a towel under it and noticed a small wooden cabinet beside the bed, warped, scratched, with a drawer that didn't close properly. When I pulled it open, something heavy clunked against the back panel, a suitcase. Old, leather, the color of burnt sienna. Its handle was wrapped in aged twine, and across the tag, written in faded ink, L. Avery, my maiden name. I froze. No one here knew me as Avery. The motel clerk had registered me under my married name, the one I now hated. Dust covered the edges like it had been there for years. The latches were sealed shut with crimson wax, the old-fashioned kind my mother used on letters when I was little, embedded in the wax. The impression of a fountain pen nib. I traced it with my thumb, and for a heartbeat. I could almost hear her voice again. Paper tells the truth when people won't. Beneath the suitcase, something thin was taped to the wood. I tugged it loose, a folded sheet of legal paper, edges yellowed with time. In my mother's handwriting, open only when you're ready to see the truth. I sat there for a long time. Dripping towel forgotten, rain whispering against the window. My breath came shallow, the air thick with something between dread and relief. What truth? What had she known that connected her name? Burns' trust. Ethan's payments. The rational part of me whispered caution that I was fragile, that I'd been wrong before, but beneath that, deeper, was something older and sharper instinct. My mother had never written words without meaning. I placed the suitcase on the bed. The leather cracked slightly under its own weight, for the first time in weeks. I felt something other than despair, not hope. Exactly. But momentum. Because grief might silence you, but injustice that makes you listen. The next morning, I went to the front desk. The clerk, a middle-aged woman with cigarette-rasped voice and a name tag that read, Rita, looked up from her crossword. Hey, Rita, I said. How long has that wooden cabinet been in room 16? She squinted. Since before me. Hun. You find something? I hesitated. Just an old suitcase. Probably junk left by some dead tenant. Happens. Any chance you'd know who stayed there before Rita shook her head? Records get tossed after 6 months. Why? No reason. But there was a reason, a big one. When I returned to my room. The suitcase sat waiting on the bed, wax glinting faintly in the light. It wasn't coincidence, not anymore. Not after everything that had been taken from me. I thought of the board email she'll never notice until the escrow clears. They'd erased my accounts, my name, my reputation. But they hadn't erased her. My mother had left something behind, hidden in a place where only someone desperate enough, broken enough, would look. That night, I turned off the light. The sound of rain returned, steady and rhythmic, like a heartbeat behind the walls. I placed my hand on the suitcase and whispered, I'm ready. But I didn't open it yet. Because when everything you've known turns out to be a lie, even the truth can be terrifying. And somehow, I knew once I lifted that lid, there'd be no way back to the life I'd been pretending to rebuild. It took me 3 days to find the courage. The suitcase sat on the dresser like a living thing, humming with silent weight, every time I glanced at it. I heard my mother's voice, distant, patient, unyielding. Open only when you're ready to see the truth. I wasn't ready, but I was out of options. The morning I finally did it. The sky over Queens was pale and lidless. The sound of traffic below my window blended with the low hum of a broken neon sign from the liquor store across the street. I lit the one candle I had, a cheap lavender votive from the bodega, and melted its wax over the crimson seal. The red softened, cracked, and split like dried blood. The latches popped open with a sigh. Inside, beneath a folded wool coat that smelled faintly of cedar, lay a stack of envelopes wrapped with twine. A passport in my maiden name, Lauren Avery, and 3 neat bundles of cash, each labeled $10,000 beneath them. Another 3 bundles, $70,000 in total. And at the very bottom, a cream-colored envelope sealed with my mother's initials in blue ink. My hands shook as I opened it. Lauren, if you're reading this, it means what I feared has happened. The trust I built wasn't for charity, it was for protection. The real inheritance is kept at this address. Don't trust Ethan or Carly. They've been preparing this for years. You'll find what's yours in Boston. Be discreet. Don't call anyone from your old life. And remember, paper lasts longer than lies. Mom, Margaret Reeves. The words blurred as my tears hit the page. Boston. I read it again. Slower this time, tracing the ink grooves. My mother's handwriting was unmistakable, crisp, deliberate, with tiny serifs on every T. The signature carried the same swoop I'd seen on the trust documents Ethan had processed after her funeral. He'd been the executor. He'd filed everything. He'd told me there was nothing left but memories. The bile rose in my throat. If this letter was real, and it was then Ethan hadn't just stolen from me, he'd stolen from her. I turned the suitcase upside down, scattering the envelopes and bills across the bed. Hidden beneath the lining was a folded document, property deed, 217 Hawthorne Street. Cambridge. M.A. There was also a small brass key taped to the paper. The notary seal on the corner read, January 14th, 2021, 6 months before my mother's death. 4 years. 4 years that Ethan had kept this buried, pretending he was settling her estate while selling off what she left behind. I thought of every time he'd said, don't dwell on the past. Lore, move forward. He hadn't wanted me to move forward. He'd wanted me blind. By nightfall, I'd made my decision the next morning. I'd take the first train to Boston. But first, I needed to make sure the money was real, that this wasn't some elaborate ghost of paranoia. I counted it again. All $70,000, crisp hundreds, sequential serials. Bank wrapped. Real. There was also a plane ticket folded beneath the passport, a one-way flight from JFK to Logan International. The date open-ended, no return. The reservation had been booked under L. Avery, purchased from a corporate account labeled Reeves Education Fund. My breath caught. That fund hadn't existed since my mother's trust supposedly dissolved, unless it had never dissolved at all. I packed light jeans, the fountain pen, the deed, and my mother's letter. The rest of my life fit into a grocery bag, a toothbrush, 2 changes of clothes, the laptop I could no longer log into. At sunrise. I went downstairs to the motel office. Rita, the manager, was sitting behind the counter, smoking over a crossword. The television behind her played a game show no one was watching. She looked up as I placed the key on the counter. Checking out, I nodded. Yeah. She eyed the suitcase. Heading somewhere better. I hope. Boston, I said. Her eyebrows lifted. Big jump. I guess. As she slid the deposit receipt toward me, she paused. Funny thing. She said, not many people come out of this place with luggage heavier than when they came in. I smiled faintly. Guess I travel differently. She grinned, exhaling smoke. Keep it that way, sweetheart. Outside. The morning air smelled like diesel and new beginnings. I walked the few blocks to the subway, clutching the suitcase by its worn leather handle. The city unfolded around me, impatient, indifferent, somewhere. Sirens wailed, somewhere else. A vendor shouted over the hiss of steam, but inside me, something quiet had shifted, for the first time in months. I wasn't just surviving, I was moving toward, on the train to Penn Station. I read the letter again. My mother's words seemed to rearrange themselves with every passing mile. Don't trust Ethan or Carly. They've been preparing this for years. That meant she'd known them before me. The thought chilled me. Ethan had met my mother once, briefly, before our engagement. Or so he'd said. Carly. I'd introduced later. Had I been the mark all along when the train slowed into the station? I caught my reflection in the window. I looked nothing like the woman who'd once hosted dinner parties and signed audit reports in silk blouses. This version of me had shadows under her eyes, hair pulled into a careless knot, a stranger's determination behind her face. I boarded the Amtrak to Boston. The suitcase sat beside me, silent and loyal, like it had been waiting for this moment longer than I had. As the train rolled north, I pressed my hand against the brass key in my pocket and whispered under my breath, "Whatever you left for me, Mom, I'm coming." The city receded. The horizon opened, and somewhere between Queens and Cambridge, I stopped being the woman they destroyed and started becoming the one who would make them regret it. Boston greeted me with the kind of cold that slips straight through your clothes. An intelligent cold, deliberate. Surgical? The cab rolled past brownstones and bare trees to 217 Hawthorne Street, the address on the deed. The townhouse looked asleep, like no one had lived there in years. Faded ivy clung to the bricks, windows clouded with dust, but the number plate on the door was new brass polished, recent fingerprints smudged across it. I hesitated on the porch, suitcase in hand, my breath made ghosts in the air, somewhere behind me. A church bell struck noon precise, indifferent. The key from the suitcase slid perfectly into the lock. A click. Soft as exhalation. The door opened to silence. Inside. The air smelled faintly of cedar and old paper, the scent of my childhood. Bookshelves lined the narrow hall, filled with law journals, economics texts, a few framed photos of my mother at Harvard law chalk on her fingers, her expression mid-argument. Dust softened everything, turning the rooms into grayscale memories. On the dining table, a single item weighted a manila folder marked Byron Heritage Trust, Articles of Incorporation. My stomach tightened. The folder was dated June 2015, a year before my mother died. She had been chairperson of the board. The vice chair listed Martin Byrne. That was the first blow. The second came when I noticed the beneficiary section heir to designate. No name filled in, just a blank line, waiting for a signature. I knew whose they'd wanted there. The basement door groaned open, a draft of cold air spiraling up from below. I flicked on the light switch. Nothing. The bulb had long since died. Using my phone flashlight? I descended the narrow steps, each creak a small betrayal. The basement was a time capsule boxes stacked in corners, an old filing cabinet, a row of framed certificates warped by humidity. Cobwebs glistened in the beam of my light. Then I saw it a metal safe, chest high, bolted to the floor behind a draped cloth. My hand closed around the brass key from the suitcase. It matched the lock perfectly. When the door swung open, the smell of sealed air rushed out metallic, forgotten. Inside were three things. 1. A folder of legal documents stamped with notary seals, Byrne Heritage Trust deed, original copy. 2. A flash drive in a small glass case. 3. A handwritten letter on my mother's stationery, never sent. I sat on the concrete floor, knees pulled close, and opened the folder first. The trust deed was indisputable. My mother, Margaret Reeves, had been the founder and controlling trustee of the Byrne Heritage Trust, not a consultant, not an advisor, founder. The deed clearly outlined the trust's purpose to fund community law programs and environmental land protection, not luxury developments. Clause 9b, handwritten in her script, any transfer or escrow arrangement executed without direct heir consent shall be deemed null and void under automatic forfeiture. Automatic forfeiture. The clause Ethan and Byrne's attorney had erased in the revised version I'd seen at the firm. They hadn't just stolen money, they had stolen authorship. My hands trembled as I opened the letter. Lauren, if they ever find this, go to attorney Julia Chen. She knows the clause. She helped me draft it when I realized Martin was restructuring the trust behind my back. Ethan is part of it. Don't be charmed. He was placed there to gain your signature. They need you to consent before dissolving my share. Don't sign anything, no matter the pressure, if you're reading this. They're closer than you think. Mom. The paper slipped from my fingers. For a long moment. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Every dinner, every anniversary, every whispered trust me. Babe had all been scripted. Ethan hadn't fallen in love with me by chance. He had been assigned to me. The perfect infiltration, the husband, the friend, the company, the trifecta of betrayal. I plugged the flash drive into my laptop, heart pounding. A single audio file appeared, Greenshore Och Call Record, Dark 4 Dwar 18.mp3, static at first. Then voices. Martin Byrne. The heir's access is still active, but we can close the escrow once Ethan gets her signature. Ethan. She won't sign if she suspects. Carly can help distract her. She trusts Carly more than anyone. Carly, just tell me what to say. She still thinks this fund is about her mom's scholarship program. We'll keep it clean. Byrne good. Once the Green Shore project closes, We'll dissolve the trust and reassign assets under my holding company. Make sure the compliance logs show Lauren Avery as the approving officer. Ethan's voice, calm and efficient. She won't notice. She never reads the final drafts. She trusts me. Static swallowed the end of the recording, but not before Byrne added, laughing softly, "Then let's drink to the power of trust." I sat frozen, the laptop screen reflecting in my eyes, the sound of their voices, people I had loved, defended. Fed filled the room like ghosts reciting my eulogy. The walls seemed to close in, the weight of 4 years pressing down. My entire marriage had been a contract my affection. A legal instrument? I pressed my palms against the cold floor to keep from shaking. Somewhere above me, a pipe dripped steadily. Each drop punctuated the silence like a countdown. When I finally stood, the edges of everything felt too sharp, the air, the stairs, my own pulse, at the top of the steps. I turned off the flashlight. The dark felt honest. Upstairs, I sat at my mother's old desk, laid out the trust deed, the USB, the letter. The candle I'd carried from the motel flickered on the table, flame bending like a spine under pressure. Everything was proof not just of theft, but of design. They hadn't ruined my life by accident. They'd mapped it. And for the first time, I understood the scale of what I was up against. Ethan wasn't the betrayal. He was the tool. Byrne was the architect. And Carly, the bridge between trust and destruction, outside. The streetlights came on, one by one. The city hummed beyond the window, oblivious, civilized, blind. I gathered the documents, sealed them back into the suitcase, but before closing it, I whispered into the empty room, "You were right, Mom. Paper does last longer than lies. Tomorrow, I would find attorney Julia Chen, and this time, I wouldn't be walking into a trap. I'd be building one." The next morning, the air in Cambridge smelled like ink and frost. I barely slept. The city was waking up in shades of gray and exhaust as I stood outside the address scrawled at the bottom of my mother's letter, Julia Chen. Attorney at law. The office sat above a used bookstore near Harvard Square. A brass plaque by the door read, "Contracts are written by those who know what to fear." It sounded exactly like something my mother would have said. When I stepped inside, the bell chimed. A woman looked up from her desk, sharp bob, sharp suit, sharper eyes. "You must be Margaret's daughter," she said. Her voice carried both recognition and restraint, as if she'd been expecting this day for years. "I'm Julia." She motioned to a chair. I sat clutching the suitcase like it was an oxygen tank. "I found this," I said quietly, laying the trust deed on her desk. And the recording. Julia adjusted her glasses, scanning the pages with a focus that made time slow down. Her finger paused on the handwritten section, clause 9B, automatic forfeiture. "Ah," she murmured. "Margaret's little masterpiece." She looked up. "Do you know what this means?" I shook my head. "It's a kill switch," she said. "The automatic forfeiture clause voids any transfer of the trust's assets if it's done without the heir's consent. Whoever attempts it, Byrne, your ex-husband, anyone automatically forfeits all claim, and the assets revert to the rightful trustee, you." I blinked. "So legally, it's already mine technically?" "Yes, but legally, not yet." Julia leaned forward, hands clasped. "For the clause to activate, the breach must be publicly established. It's not enough to know, you have to show it." She smiled, a flash of calm ruthlessness. Margaret built her own revenge into the paperwork, for the first time in months. I felt something that resembled oxygen. Julia poured tea strong, dark, bitter. "We'll need to do this carefully," she said. "They have more money, more lawyers, and more media control, but they underestimate one thing, documentation." She flipped through the deed again. "Your mother kept impeccable records. You just have to make them impossible to ignore." "How?" "By creating a trail they can't race." She pulled a legal pad toward her and began to outline. 1. Reconstruct the paper chain, using the originals from the safe. We'd rebuild the trust's transaction history, showing every illegal transfer Byrne and Ethan made under false signatures. 2. Send an anonymous subpoena request to the SEC. We'd flag Byrne Holdings charity investments as potentially fraudulent, triggering an investigation. The SEC's involvement would give us legal grounds for exposure without revealing our hand too soon. 3. Secure a temporary injunction. Julia would file it under my maiden name, citing the automatic forfeiture clause as pending litigation. Once the injunction was signed by a federal clerk, any movement of trust assets would freeze. Julia filed it ex parte in federal court, under confidentiality provisions to prevent discovery leaks. And then I asked. Julia smiled. Then. We let them announce their crime in front of witnesses. 2 days later, I sat across from her in a small conference room, the trust deed spread out like a battle map. Julia pointed to the date of the upcoming Byrne Foundation Gala, the event where Martin Byrne would unveil their new venture, the Green Shore Initiative. That's when he'll declare the trust assets reassigned. She said, perfect timing. You walk in. Read Clause 9B publicly, and serve the injunction in front of the board, the press, and donors. I stared at the document. You want me to confront them there? Julia nodded. It's the only way to make it binding. The moment you read the clause aloud in an official setting, it triggers forfeiture. The law is specific upon acknowledgement of breach in the presence of any board quorum. The clause is irrevocably enacted. My heart pounded. So I can't just hide behind lawyers. I have to perform it. Julia smirked. Your mother always believed justice should have an audience. We spent the next week buried in files. Julia tracked down old correspondence between my mother and Byrne, every email, every draft contract, every timestamp. I scoured my own archives for audit reports Ethan had reviewed. Together, we built a wall of proof no denial could climb at night. I stayed in a small rental in Cambridge, rereading my mother's notes. Each line felt like she was whispering strategy across time. On the final page of her handwritten addendum, she'd scrawled a single Latin phrase, veritas vincit scriptum. The truth wins on paper. On the 4th night, Julia called me into her office. She held up a document, the official court injunction, stamped and sealed. File number 23F1047, issued this morning. She said, Byrne Holdings can't move a single cent of that trust until further notice. I exhaled. So the accounts are frozen temporarily. But if they learn who filed it, they'll bury you in counterclaims before breakfast. So, she slid a folder across the table. We filed under Margaret Reeves' trust. Beneficiary L, Avery, my maiden name again, the one they thought they'd erased. The next morning, Julia and I rehearsed the reveal. I'd walk into the gala just as Byrne presented the Green Shore Project. Julia would be nearby, disguised as a representative from the State Land Commission, holding the injunction. My role was simple and terrifying. When Byrne announced the newly consolidated trust, I'd stand, hold up the original deed, and read Clause 9B aloud. It wasn't just confrontation, it was activation. The night before the gala, I stayed awake staring at the trust deed spread across my motel desk. The paper caught the light from the street lamp, the embossed seal glinting like a weapon waiting to be used. Outside, snow had started to fall, soft and indifferent. I picked up my mother's fountain pen, the same one that had signed the clause, and whispered, Tomorrow, Mom. The clause lives. Then I folded the document, placed it in a slim black envelope, and slipped it into my clutch. This wasn't going to be chaos. It was choreography. They had built their empire on forged paper. Now, paper would burn them. The Langham ballroom glittered like a promised chandeliers, champagne, and the careful choreography of privilege. Gold light spilled across mirrored walls, and an orchestra played something polished enough to sound effortless. I stood near the back, invisible in a black dress that belonged to another life. My pulse kept time with the string section. On stage, Ethan and Carly smiled beneath a cascade of applause. The banner behind them read, The Byrne Foundation Gala, celebrating the Green Shore Initiative. The press cameras flashed like lightning. Ethan's tuxedo gleamed. Carly's gown shimmered champagne. Together, they looked untouchable. The host raised his glass. Tonight, we honor 2 extraordinary visionaries, Ethan and Carly Avery, for their commitment to sustainable investment and philanthropy. Their names echoed through the ballroom. Laughter, clinking glasses. And then, the final cue, before we close. Martin Byrne will join them to sign the formal endowment documents. 3 signatures that would bury my mother's legacy forever. I stepped forward. The sound of my heels against marble cut through the applause like a metronome no one had planned for. The cameras swung toward me, a few heads turned, then more. Ethan's smile faltered first. Carly blinked twice, her practiced composure cracking for a fraction of a second. Byrne's expression froze the instinct of a man who senses paperwork approaching. I stopped halfway up the stage steps. "Excuse me," I said, my voice calm, carrying across the mic'd silence. "Before anyone signs anything, I believe there's a clause you all forgot to mention." A ripple moved through the crowd confusion, curiosity, anticipation. Ethan recovered quickly, slipping into his familiar charm. "Lauren," he said, tone honeyed, condescending, "this isn't the time." "Oh, I think it is." I pulled the black envelope from my clutch. The seal of notarization caught the spotlight like a blade. According to Section 12B of the Byrne Heritage Trust, I read, "Every word deliberate. Any transfer or escrow assignment executed without the heir's direct consent shall be rendered null and void under automatic forfeiture." The orchestra fell silent mid-note. Every sound in the room seemed to vanish. Ethan's voice broke the stillness, tight and defensive. That clause was voided in the restructuring. I met his gaze. "You mean the restructuring you forged?" Gasps scattered through the audience like wind through leaves. I turned toward Byrne. "Mr. Byrne, as co-founder of this trust, you should remember my mother's original deed was notarized with this seal." I held up the document, the golden emblem glinting under the chandelier. "And this is the original." Cameras began to click. Reporters instinctively raised their phones. Byrne stepped forward, jaw tight. "You don't know what you're talking about. That document isn't admissible." He stopped mid-sentence as Julia Chen stepped into the light from the back of the room. Her black suit cut through the glitter like a shadow with purpose. "Actually," she said, holding up a stamped folder, "it's already been filed." She crossed the floor with precise, deliberate steps and handed a copy to the stunned host. "Federal Injunction Number 23F1047, she announced. "Effective immediately. All Byrne Holdings trust-related accounts are frozen pending investigation by the SEC." The ballroom erupted not in applause, but in noise questions, whispers, the furious flutter of flashbulbs. Ethan's face drained of color. Carly took an instinctive step back from him, eyes wide. Byrne's phone began to vibrate on the table and kept vibrating. Julia turned to the press. "Ladies and gentlemen, copies of the injunction will be released to the media within the hour. Transparency is part of the court order." Ethan lunged forward, his voice low, desperate. "Lauren, you don't understand. This isn't what it looks like." I met his eyes. "Steady. That's exactly what you said the night you got caught with Carly. Turns out. You've been lying longer than I've been naive." Carly flinched. Byrne glared at them both. "You told me this was clean?" He hissed under his breath, but the mic caught it. Every camera heard it. Security hesitated, unsure who the threat was. Guests stood frozen financiers, journalists, board members watching the empire unravel in real time. Julia placed the court order on the podium, per the automatic forfeiture clause. She said evenly, "Control of the Byrne Heritage Trust reverts to its legal trustee, Miss Lauren Avery." I inhaled slowly, the room holding its breath with me. Effective immediately. The flashbulbs exploded again like thunder breaking glass. Byrne's lawyer pushed through the crowd, stammering about misunderstandings and pending reviews. Julia only handed him a crisp copy of the injunction. "Already reviewed," she said. "Already binding." Ethan looked at me the same face I'd once woken up beside, now pale with disbelief. "You think you've won," he whispered. "No," I said. "My mother did." Within hours. The headlines were everywhere. Byrne Holdings charity under federal investigation, philanthropist power couple accused of fraud. Unknown heir reclaims trust in stunning gala showdown. By the next morning, the SEC had frozen every Byrne Foundation account. The Greenshore project was suspended indefinitely. Investors fled. Carly issued a statement claiming she'd been misled. By afternoon, she had quietly resigned from the board. Ethan's emails to the firm leaked within 48 hours confirming his role in falsifying trust documents. Federal subpoenas followed before the week ended, and Byron. He was summoned to testify before a federal ethics committee, his empire crumbling beneath the weight of his own arrogance. I stayed quiet. I didn't give interviews. Julia handled the legal aftermath while I watched from my mother's townhouse in Cambridge, the same house where it all began. The suitcase sat beside my desk, still half open, holding the letter that had started everything. A week later. A single email arrived from the state registrar's office subject to trust reassignment, confirmed. Bodimes Lauren Avery. You are now the sole legal trustee of the Bearton Heritage Trust. I stared at the screen until the letters blurred. Then, slowly, I exhaled. Not triumph. Just release. That night, I walked along the Charles River under a cold blue moon. The wind carried the sound of sirens far off the city's version of applause. For the first time in years. I felt steady. My mother's voice echoed in memory, if you sign without reading, you're not being loyal, you're being blind. I hadn't signed. I'd read everything, and I'd made them read it too. 6 months later. The city had softened around the edges. The snow had melted, leaving the Charles River glittering like mercury under early spring light. From the top floor of a modest building in downtown Boston, a new sign had gone up in brushed steel letters, the Reeves Foundation, below it, in smaller print for women, whistleblowers, and the truth inside. The air smelled of new paint and determination. The walls were bare except for one framed quote, handwritten in faded ink. My mother's handwriting. Truth wins on paper. The same phrase that had carried me through every sleepless night. That morning, sunlight streamed across my desk, catching the gold embossing on a stack of legal envelopes. They were applications women reaching out from all over the country. Former employees of corporations that silenced them. Wives left penniless after manipulative divorces. Assistants who discovered fraud but had nowhere to turn. Julia leaned against the doorway, coffee in hand. You realize you've created something terrifying? Right. I smiled. You mean hopeful? She raised an eyebrow. To them. It's the same thing. The foundation had started small 2 rooms, 3 staffers, a handful of volunteers, but word had spread fast. The story of the woman who stopped a $1 billion trust heist with one clause had become its own mythology. Donors who'd once toasted Byrne's name now quietly wired support to mine. The irony was almost poetic. At noon, I met with the first grant recipient, a teacher from Vermont whose ex-husband had hidden assets under false corporate names. She sat across from me, nervous, clutching her case file like it might vanish. When she finished telling her story, I said simply, "We'll help you. And we'll make sure the next version of him thinks twice." Her eyes filled with tears. She squeezed my hand before leaving. After she was gone, I sat alone for a moment, staring at the foundation seal embossed on my desk. It wasn't victory. It was work. And it was finally mine. That evening, I visited my mother's townhouse in Cambridge, now restored, the dust replaced by quiet order. The safe still sat in the corner, but now it held new files, new trust deeds, written to protect rather than deceive. I placed a single white lily by her photograph. We did it. Mom. I whispered, they can't rewrite us anymore. Outside. Rain had begun to fall soft, cleansing, steady. Later that night, back at my office. I stayed late reviewing case notes. The city glowed beyond the windows, bridges like veins of gold across dark water. The rhythmic hum of traffic below sounded almost like breathing. I was signing the last document when the receptionist knocked. This just came in, she said, handing me a brown envelope. No return address. The handwriting on the front was deliberate, almost old-fashioned, just 3 words. For your eyes. I waited until the office was empty before opening it. Inside was a single page thick, cream-colored paper, folded once, typed, not handwritten. Lauren. There's a second trust. Offshore, signed by your mother and Martin Byrne's son, look into the Cayman accounts. 2014-2016, a friend of Margaret. I stared at it, my heart beat loud in my ears. The paper trembled slightly between my fingers. Martin Byrne's son. The Byrne family had been scrubbed clean from the news cycle since the scandal his properties seized. His reputation destroyed? I hadn't even known he had a son old enough to sign anything. For a moment. I almost laughed, not from disbelief, but from recognition. Justice never ends neatly. It folds, rewrites itself, hides in footnotes and offshore ledgers. I set the note down carefully and walked to the window. Boston stretched beneath me bright, cold, alive. My reflection in the glass looked older, steadier. Not the woman from the motel, not even the one who stood in that ballroom. This version of me was different forged, not broken. The rain streaked the glass, and the city lights fractured into hundreds of golden lines, each one a path I hadn't walked yet. Somewhere out there. Another truth waited. I thought about Ethan facing sentencing for fraud, about Carly, who'd fled the country before the hearings but was now rumored to be cooperating with investigators, and about Byrne, still fighting extradition, his empire reduced to sealed evidence boxes. The justice system had moved slowly, but it had moved, and I'd moved faster. I turned back to my desk, slid the anonymous letter into a folder labeled Next Steps, and smiled faintly. Guess I'm not done yet. A courier in a gray suit slips another envelope onto Julia's desk. She opens it. Inside a photo. Lauren's mother, Margaret, standing beside a younger man at a signing table, the caption typed beneath Zurich. 2014, Reeves-Byron Agreement. Julia's eyes widen. She looks up toward the window. The lights of Boston shimmer on her glasses. For a heartbeat. Even the city outside seemed to hold its breath. Would you choose forgiveness or revenge if you found that suitcase?